In the time before time, when the world was young and God's creation was perfect, there lived a man named Enoch. This man would witness something so amazing and terrifying that people are still talking about it thousands of years later. He saw a war in heaven between good angels and bad angels. He watched as mighty beings fought for the future of all creation. This is that incredible story. Long ago, before Noah built his ark, before the great flood covered the earth, there was a battle that shook the very foundations of heaven and earth. It was not a battle fought with swords or spears like men fight. It was a spiritual war between the forces of light and darkness, between obedience and rebellion, between love and pride. The story begins with creatures called watchers. These were special angels that God had made to watch over his creation. They were powerful, beautiful, and wise. They were supposed to serve God and help protect the people on earth. But something went terribly wrong. Some of these watchers made a choice that would change everything forever. This choice led to the first war ever fought. It was a war that started in the perfect halls of heaven and spilled down to the earth below. Angels fought against angels. Brothers in creation became bitter enemies. And in the middle of it all, one special man named Enoch was chosen by God to see it all happen and tell the world about it. Chapter 1. Meet Enoch and his ancient world. To understand this amazing story, we need to meet the man who saw it all happen. His name was Enoch, and he lived in a world very different from ours today. Enoch lived about 4,000 years before Jesus was born. The world was still young then. People lived much longer than they do now. Some people lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. Enoch's great-great-great-grandfather was Adam, the very first man God ever made. His grandfather was Methuselah, who lived longer than any other person in history. He lived for 969 years. In those days, people still remembered the Garden of Eden. They passed down stories about how perfect everything used to be before sin came into the world. They told their children about the tree of life and the tree of good and evil. They remembered how Adam and Eve walked with God in the cool of the evening. But by the time Enoch was born, the world had changed a lot. Sin had been growing like weeds in a garden. People were becoming more and more evil. They were forgetting about God and doing whatever they wanted to do. Violence was everywhere. People were hurting each other and being mean and selfish. Enoch was different from most people in his time. While others were turning away from God, Enoch was getting closer to him. Every day, Enoch would spend time talking to God. He would pray and listen for God's voice. He tried his best to live the way God wanted him to live. He was kind to others. He told the truth, and he helped people who were in trouble. The Bible says that Enoch walked with God. This means that Enoch and God were like best friends. They spent time together every single day. God would teach Enoch things that other people did not know. He would show Enoch secrets about heaven and earth. He would explain things about angels and spirits that most people never got to learn about. Enoch lived in a time when heaven and earth were much closer together than they are now. Angels would sometimes visit people on earth. People could sometimes see into the spirit world. It was not unusual for someone to have dreams or visions from God. But even in those days, what happened to Enoch was very special and very rare. God loved Enoch so much that he decided to show him some of the most important secrets of the universe. God wanted Enoch to understand what was really happening in the world. He wanted Enoch to see why there was so much evil and violence on earth. He wanted to show Enoch the spiritual battle that was being fought behind the scenes. Enoch had a job to do. God wanted him to be like a reporter or a messenger. Enoch would see amazing things in heaven, and then he would come back and tell other people about them. He would write down what he saw so that future generations could learn about it too. This was a big responsibility, and God knew that Enoch was the right man for the job. Enoch was also a prophet. This means that God would give him messages about what would happen in the future. Enoch could see things that had not happened yet. He saw the flood that would come in Noah's time. He saw the coming of Jesus many thousands of years later. He even saw the end of the world and God's final judgment. But before God showed Enoch all these future things, he first showed him something that had happened in the past. God took Enoch back to see the beginning of all the trouble on earth. He showed him why the world had become so dark and dangerous. He revealed to Enoch the secret rebellion that had started in heaven itself. Chapter 2: The Watchers and Their Holy Purpose. Before we can understand what went wrong, we need to learn about these special angels called the Watchers and what they were supposed to do. When God first made the heavens and the earth, He created many different kinds of angels. Some angels spent all their time around God's throne, singing His praises and worshipping Him. Others were like messengers who carried God's words to people on earth. Some were warriors who fought against evil, and some were teachers who helped people understand God's ways. The Watchers were a very special group of angels. Their job was to watch over God's creation and make sure everything was working the way God wanted it to work. They were like supervisors or managers in heaven's government. God gave them great power and great responsibility. There were many Watchers, but some of the most important ones had names that we still know today. There was Semjaza, who was one of their leaders. There was Azazel, who was very skilled in making things with metal. There was Barakiel, who understood the stars and the weather. There was Kokabel, who knew about time and seasons. There was Chazakiel, who understood the clouds and the sky. These angels were incredibly beautiful and powerful. They shined with the glory of God. They could fly faster than lightning. They could appear and disappear in an instant. They knew things that humans could never figure out on their own. They understood how the stars moved, how the seasons changed, how plants grew, and how animals lived. The Watchers were supposed to be like guardian angels for all of creation. They watched over the animals to make sure they had what they needed. They watched over the weather to make sure the rain came at the right times. They watched over the stars and planets to make sure they stayed in their proper places. They watched over human beings to protect them from danger and to help them learn about God. God had given the Watchers the ability to see both the spiritual world and the physical world at the same time. This means they could see what was happening on Earth, but they could also see the spiritual forces that were behind what was happening. They could see demons trying to tempt people. They could see God's angels helping and protecting people. They could see the spiritual battle between good and evil. The Watchers were also teachers. When people needed to learn something important, God would sometimes send a Watcher to teach them. The Watchers taught people how to grow better food, how to take care of their animals, how to build stronger houses, and how to live together in peace. But the most important job of the Watchers was to help people stay close to God. They would remind people to pray and worship God. They would warn people when they were starting to do wrong things. They would encourage people to be kind and loving to each other. They were supposed to be like bridges between heaven and earth, helping people understand God's love and God's ways. The Watchers had been doing this job for a long time, and they were very good at it. Creation was running smoothly under their care. People were learning and growing. The animals were thriving. Everything seemed to be working perfectly according to God's plan. But there was one rule that God had given to all angels, including the Watchers. This rule was very important, and God had made it very clear. Angels were not supposed to become too involved with human beings in certain ways. They were supposed to help people and teach people, but they were not supposed to become like people themselves. Angels lived in the spiritual realm, and humans lived in the physical realm. God had made each group for different purposes. Angels were meant to serve God directly and to help care for His creation. Humans were meant to live on earth, to have families, to take care of the earth, and to worship God in their own special way. God had designed this system perfectly. Angels and humans each had their own roles to play. When everyone stayed in their proper place and did their proper job, everything worked beautifully. There was peace between heaven and earth. There was harmony in all of creation. For a long time, the Watchers were happy with their job. They loved serving God. They enjoyed watching over creation and seeing it flourish under their care. They felt proud and fulfilled when they helped people learn new things or when they protected people from danger. Chapter 3: The Great Temptation and Fall. But something began to change in the hearts of some of the Watchers. It started small, like a tiny crack in a strong wall, but it grew bigger and bigger until it broke everything apart. As the Watchers spent more and more time watching over human beings, some of them began to notice how different their lives were from the lives of the people on earth. Humans got to experience things that angels never could. They could feel the warmth of the sun on their skin and the cool breeze in their hair. They could taste delicious food and smell beautiful flowers. They could touch things with their hands and feel the softness of grass under their feet. But most of all, some of the Watchers began to notice the women on earth. These women were beautiful in a way that was completely different from the beauty of angels. They had soft voices and gentle ways. They could laugh and cry and show emotions in ways that touched the hearts of these watching angels. At first, this was just curiosity. The Watchers wondered what it would be like to experience life the way humans did. They wondered what it would feel like to have a physical body instead of a spiritual one. They wondered what it would be like to live on earth instead of in heaven. But curiosity slowly turned into desire. Some of the watchers began to want these things more and more. They started to think that maybe God was being unfair by not letting them experience life the way humans did. They began to feel jealous of the humans they were supposed to be protecting. This was the beginning of pride in their hearts. Pride is when we think we know better than God about what is good for us. Pride is when we want something so much that we are willing to disobey God to get it. Pride was the same sin that had caused Satan to rebel against God in the first place. The leader of this growing rebellion was an angel named Semjaza. He was one of the most important and powerful watchers. Other angels looked up to him and respected him. If Semjaza said something, other angels listened. This made him very influential, but it also made his rebellion very dangerous. Semjaza began to talk quietly with other watchers about his feelings. He told them how he longed to experience life on earth. He told them how beautiful the human women were and how much he wished he could be with them. He began to plant seeds of discontent and rebellion in their hearts too. At first, many of the watchers were shocked by what Semjaza was saying. They reminded him of God's rules and of their duty to serve God faithfully. They told him that these thoughts were dangerous and that he should ask God to help him get rid of them. But Semjaza was clever and persuasive. He began to argue that God's rules were too strict. He said that God was keeping them from experiencing the best parts of creation. He suggested that maybe God did not really love them as much as he loved human beings. He planted doubts about God's goodness and fairness. Slowly, some of the other watchers began to listen to Semjaza's arguments. The more they thought about what he was saying, the more they began to agree with him. The desire to experience earthly life grew stronger and stronger in their hearts. They began to look at the humans below, not as creatures to protect and serve, but as something they wanted for themselves. Semjaza knew that what he was thinking about doing was very serious. He knew it would mean disobeying God directly. He knew it might bring terrible consequences, but he also knew he did not want to do it alone. He wanted other angels to join him so they could all face whatever happened together. So Semjaza came up with a plan. He gathered together 200 of the watchers who had been listening to his ideas. He proposed that they all make a promise to each other. They would all agree to leave their positions in heaven and go down to earth together. They would take on physical bodies and live among the humans. They would marry human women and start families. But Semjaza was smart enough to know that some of the angels might change their minds at the last minute. So he suggested that they all take a solemn oath together. They would promise that no matter what happened, they would all go through with the plan. If any of them tried to back out, the others would force them to keep their promise. This oath was made on Mount Hermon, a tall mountain that stood between heaven and earth. All 200 of the rebellious watchers gathered there and swore their terrible promise to each other. They bound themselves together in rebellion against God. They promised to share whatever punishment might come from their disobedience. The moment they made this oath, everything changed. These angels crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They chose their own desires over God's will. They chose earthly pleasures over heavenly glory. They chose rebellion over obedience. And so the great descent began. 200 mighty angels left their positions in heaven and came down to earth. They took on physical bodies that looked like men, but they kept their supernatural powers and knowledge. They were no longer serving God as they were supposed to do. Instead, they were serving themselves and their own desires. Chapter 4. The corruption of humanity. When the fallen watchers came down to earth, they brought disaster with them, like a disease that spreads from person to person. Their rebellion began to infect all of human society. The first thing the fallen watchers did was exactly what they had planned. They found the most beautiful women on earth and took them as wives. But this was not like normal human marriage. These women had no choice in the matter. The fallen angels were so powerful that no human man could stand against them. They simply took whatever they wanted. The women were terrified at first. Imagine being chosen by a being who could appear and disappear like magic, who could fly through the air, who could do things that no human could do. These women found themselves married to creatures who looked like men, but who had powers like gods. But the fallen watchers could be very charming when they wanted to be. They were still beautiful and impressive, even though they had rebelled against God. They could speak sweetly and make amazing promises. They could do miraculous things that seemed wonderful at first. Some of the women began to feel special and important because they had been chosen by these powerful beings. The fallen watchers told their new wives that they were not ordinary angels. They claimed to be gods themselves. They said they had come down from heaven to make life better for people on earth. They promised to teach humans secrets that would make them as wise and powerful as the beings in heaven. This was the beginning of a great deception. The fallen watchers began to present themselves as helpful teachers and wise guides. They offered to share their knowledge with humans, but they did not tell the people that this knowledge came with a terrible price. Before the fallen watchers came, human society was relatively simple and peaceful. People lived in small groups and took care of each other. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and built simple shelters. They knew enough to survive and be happy, but they did not know how to hurt each other in sophisticated ways. The fallen watchers changed all of that. They began to teach humans things that God had never intended for people to know. These were not bad things in themselves, but they were too advanced for humans to handle responsibly. It was like giving a sharp knife to a small child. The knife itself is not evil, but it is dangerous in the hands of someone who is not ready for it. Azazel, one of the most skilled of the fallen watchers, taught people how to make weapons. He showed them how to dig metals out of the ground and how to heat them and shape them into swords and spears and knives. Before this, people might have fought with sticks and stones, but now they could kill each other much more easily. He also taught people how to make jewelry and cosmetics. He showed women how to paint their faces and how to wear gold and silver ornaments. This might sound harmless, but it led to vanity and jealousy. people began to care more about how they looked than about how they acted. They began to judge each other by their appearance, instead of by their character. Other fallen watchers taught people about the stars and how they moved across the sky. Again, this knowledge was not bad in itself, but people began to use it in the wrong way. Instead of using it to understand God's creation, they began to use it to try to predict the future and to worship the stars themselves instead of the God who made them. Some of the fallen watchers taught people about plants and herbs. They showed them which plants could be used as medicine, but they also showed them which plants could be used as poison. They taught people how to make drugs that could change the way their minds worked. People began to use these substances to escape from reality instead of dealing with their problems in healthy ways. The most dangerous thing the fallen watchers taught was magic and sorcery. They showed people how to try to control spiritual forces for their own benefit. They taught them spells and rituals that were supposed to give them power over other people and over nature itself. This led people away from depending on God and toward trying to be like gods themselves. As this forbidden knowledge spread among humans, society began to change rapidly. People became more selfish and greedy. They used their new knowledge to get power over other people. Wars became more deadly because of the advanced weapons. People became more concerned with pleasure and appearance than with doing what was right. The fallen watchers encouraged all of this. They liked seeing humans become more like they were, rebellious, proud, and focused on their own desires rather than on serving God. They enjoyed being worshipped and treated like gods by the people they had corrupted. But there was something else happening that was even more terrible. The marriages between the fallen watchers and human women were producing children. These children were not normal human beings. They were something new and frightening, a mixture of angelic and human nature that God had never intended to exist. Chapter 5. The Forbidden Teachings. As the fallen watchers continued to live among humans, they shared more and more of heaven's secrets. Each piece of knowledge they taught made humans more powerful, but also more dangerous to themselves and others. The fallen watchers had access to information that God had meant to keep hidden from humans, at least for a while. They knew how the universe worked in ways that people were not ready to understand. They knew about spiritual forces and natural laws that were supposed to remain mysteries. But in their rebellion, they decided to reveal these secrets, not because they wanted to help humanity, but because they wanted to feel important and powerful. One of the most dangerous things they taught was about the spiritual world itself. Before the fallen watchers came, most people understood that there was a spiritual realm, but they did not try to manipulate it. They prayed to God and trusted Him to take care of spiritual matters. But the fallen watchers taught people how to try to contact and control spiritual beings directly. They showed people how to perform rituals that were supposed to call upon demons and evil spirits. They taught them how to make deals with these dark forces, trading their souls for temporary power or pleasure. They revealed the true names of demons and how to summon them. This opened doorways between the physical world and the spiritual world that should have remained closed. People began to practice these dark arts eagerly. They liked the idea of having supernatural power without having to obey God's rules. They enjoyed feeling like they could control their own destiny through magic, instead of having to depend on God's grace and mercy. The Fallen Watchers also taught advanced mathematics and engineering. They showed people how to build much larger and more complex structures than they had ever built before. This led to the construction of great cities and towers that were monuments to human pride, rather than expressions of gratitude to God. They revealed secrets about the human body and how it worked. This knowledge was used to develop both healing arts and harmful practices. People learned how to treat diseases and injuries, but they also learned how to poison each other more effectively and how to cause pain and suffering in sophisticated ways. The Fallen Watchers taught people about time and seasons in ways that went far beyond what was needed for farming and basic survival. They revealed how to make detailed predictions about when certain events would happen based on the movements of stars and planets. People began to believe that their lives were controlled by these heavenly bodies, rather than by their own choices and God's providence. Music and art were also corrupted by the Fallen Watchers' teachings. They showed people how to create music and images that were designed to stir up emotions in unhealthy ways. Instead of music that praised God and brought peace to the heart, people began to make music that excited lust, anger, and violence. Instead of art that reflected God's beauty, they made art that glorified evil and rebellion. Perhaps most significantly, the Fallen Watchers taught people how to organize themselves for war and conquest. They revealed military strategies and tactics that made human conflicts much more deadly and devastating. They showed people how to build better weapons, how to organize large armies, and how to attack and defend cities effectively. All of this knowledge spread rapidly among human populations. People were fascinated by these new abilities and eager to learn more. They did not understand that each piece of forbidden knowledge was like a chain that bound them more tightly to the Fallen Watchers and to the spiritual rebellion they represented. The Fallen Watchers presented themselves as great teachers and benefactors of humanity. They encouraged people to see them as wise guides who had come to lift humans up to a higher level of existence. They promised that by learning these secrets, people could become like gods themselves, knowing good and evil and having power over their own lives. But the reality was very different. As people learned and practiced these forbidden arts, they became more and more enslaved to their own desires and to the dark spiritual forces that the Fallen Watchers served. Instead of becoming more free, they became less free. Instead of becoming more like God, they became more like demons. The knowledge itself was not necessarily evil, but humanity was not spiritually mature enough to handle it responsibly. It was like giving a loaded gun to a child who does not understand the difference between a toy and a deadly weapon. The results were predictably disastrous. Violence increased dramatically as people used their new knowledge of weapons and warfare against each other. Greed and envy multiplied as people used their understanding of metals and craftsmanship to accumulate wealth and status symbols. pride and rebellion against God grew as people believed they could achieve anything through their own knowledge and power. Society began to break down under the weight of all this corruption. The simple, peaceful communities that had existed before gave way to complex, violent civilizations based on power, wealth, and the exploitation of the weak by the strong. Chapter 6: The Nephilim Giants. The most shocking and terrifying result of the fallen Watchers' rebellion was the birth of their children. These were not ordinary human beings, but something entirely new and monstrous. When the fallen Watchers took human women as wives, the children that were born from these unions were called the Nephilim. This word means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. From the moment they were born, it was clear that these children were completely different from normal human babies. The Nephilim grew at an incredible rate. While normal human children took years to grow from babies to adults, the Nephilim seemed to grow almost before their parents' eyes. Within just a few years, they were as large as grown men, but they did not stop growing there. They continued to grow until they became giants of enormous size. Some of the Nephilim grew to be 10 feet tall. Others grew even larger than that. There are stories of some who were 15 or even 20 feet tall. Imagine meeting a person who was 3 times taller than you, with strength to match their size. These giants were incredibly strong, much stronger than any normal human being could ever be. But their size and strength were not the most frightening things about the Nephilim. What made them truly dangerous was their character. They had inherited the prideful, rebellious nature of their fallen Watcher fathers, but they also had the physical appetites and desires of their human mothers. This combination created beings who were both supernaturally powerful and completely selfish. The Nephilim had no respect for God or for other people. They believed that their great size and strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted from anyone they wanted to take it from. They saw normal humans as inferior beings who existed only to serve them. At first, the Nephilim were content to demand food from the humans around them, but their appetites were as enormous as their bodies. They could eat as much food in one meal as a normal family would eat in a week. Soon, they were consuming so much food that there was not enough left for the regular people. When the humans could no longer provide enough food to satisfy their hunger, the Nephilim began to eat the animals. They would take entire herds of cattle, flocks of sheep, and any other animals they could find. They ate them all, leaving nothing for the people who depended on these animals for their own survival. But even this was not enough to satisfy their endless hunger. The most terrible thing about the Nephilim was that they eventually began to eat people themselves. They became cannibals, hunting humans like animals and devouring them. The very beings who should have been protecting humanity became its greatest predators. The Nephilim also inherited supernatural abilities from their fallen Watcher fathers. They could do things that normal humans could never do. Some could move with incredible speed. Others had supernatural strength that allowed them to lift enormous stones and tear down buildings with their bare hands. Some could see in the dark or hear sounds from great distances. These abilities, combined with their enormous size and evil character, made the Nephilim virtually unstoppable. Normal humans had no way to defend themselves against these monsters. No weapon that humans possessed could seriously hurt a Nephilim. No wall or fortress could keep them out if they wanted to get in. The Nephilim began to rule over human societies like tyrants. They would move into an area and declare themselves to be the kings and gods of all the people living there. They demanded to be worshipped and served. They took whatever they wanted and killed anyone who tried to resist them. Some of the Nephilim became the rulers of great cities and nations. They built enormous monuments to themselves and forced thousands of people to work as their slaves. They created civilizations based on fear and oppression, where the strong dominated the weak and showed no mercy to anyone. The fallen watchers were proud of their giant children at first. They saw the Nephilim as proof of their own power and superiority. They encouraged their children to dominate the earth and to spread the rebellion against God even further. But as time went on, even the fallen watchers began to realize that they had created something terrible. The Nephilim were so violent and destructive that they were ruining everything, even the corrupt civilization that the fallen watchers had been trying to build. The giants had no self-control and no wisdom. They were like a fire that burns everything in its path, including the things that started the fire in the first place. The Nephilim also began to fight among themselves. Since each one believed he was superior to all others, they could not live peacefully together. Giant fought against giant in battles that shook the earth and destroyed entire regions. Their wars were so devastating that they left whole areas uninhabitable. As the Nephilim multiplied and spread across the earth, they carried their violence and corruption with them everywhere they went. No place was safe from their influence. They corrupted human societies wherever they settled. They taught people to be as cruel and selfish as they were themselves. The normal humans who survived under Nephilim rule became almost as evil as their giant oppressors. Living in constant fear and seeing violence and cruelty every day, many people began to think that this was just the way life was supposed to be. They forgot about kindness, mercy, and justice. They learned to survive by being as ruthless as possible. The whole earth began to fill with violence and corruption because of the Nephilim and their influence. What had started as a rebellion by 200 angels had spread like a disease until it infected almost all of human civilization. Chapter 7: Heaven's Response and God's Judgment. While all of this evil was spreading across the earth, God was not ignoring what was happening. He saw everything that the fallen watchers and their Nephilim children were doing, and his heart was filled with both anger and sorrow. God had created the earth to be a place of beauty, peace, and harmony. He had made humans to be his special children who would take care of his creation and worship him with grateful hearts. He had designed angels to serve him and to help protect and guide his creation. But now, everything was being twisted and corrupted. The faithful angels in heaven were also watching what was happening on earth. and they were deeply troubled by what they saw. These good angels had remained loyal to God when the Watchers rebelled. They continued to serve God faithfully and to carry out His will. But they could see that the rebellion of their former brothers was causing terrible suffering for the humans they all loved. 4 of the most important archangels came before God's throne to report what they were seeing and to ask for His intervention. Their names were Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. Each of these great angels had special responsibilities in God's government, and each was deeply concerned about the crisis that was unfolding on earth. Michael was the greatest warrior among the angels. He was the one who led God's army against any spiritual enemies. He had fought against Satan himself when Satan first rebelled against God. Now Michael could see that another great spiritual battle was needed to deal with the fallen Watchers and their corruption of the earth. Gabriel was God's chief messenger. He was the one who carried God's most important communications to people on earth. Gabriel could see how the fallen Watchers' false teachings were leading people away from the truth about God and towards spiritual destruction. Raphael was known as the healer among the angels. He was concerned with helping people who were hurt or sick. Raphael could see all the suffering that the Nephilim were causing to innocent people, and his heart was moved with compassion for the victims of their cruelty. Uriel was associated with God's judgment and purification. He was the one who carried out God's justice when evil needed to be punished and removed. Uriel could see that the corruption on earth had become so bad that it threatened to destroy everything good that remained. These 4 archangels stood before God and presented their case. They described the violence of the Nephilim, the corruption of human society, and the suffering of innocent people. They explained how the fallen Watchers were teaching forbidden knowledge and leading people into spiritual darkness. They asked God to intervene before it was too late to save anything. God listened to their report, but of course He already knew everything that was happening. God sees everything all the time. He had been watching the growing corruption with great sadness. He loved the humans who were suffering, and He was angry at the fallen angels who were causing such destruction. But God is also perfectly just, which means He always does what is right and fair. He could not simply ignore the rebellion of the fallen Watchers or pretend that their crimes did not matter. Justice demanded that there be consequences for their actions. The innocent needed to be protected, and the guilty needed to be punished. At the same time, God is merciful and loving. He did not want to destroy everything He had made. He still cared about the humans who had been corrupted by the fallen Watchers' influence. Many of them were victims rather than willing participants in the rebellion. God wanted to find a way to save as many as possible while still dealing with the evil that threatened to destroy everything. So God made a plan that would bring justice to the fallen Watchers, protection to the innocent, and hope for the future. It would not be easy, and it would require great changes to the world as it existed. But it was the only way to deal with the crisis that the rebellion had created. First, God decided that the fallen Watchers themselves had to be removed from the earth. They could not be allowed to continue corrupting human society and teaching forbidden knowledge. Their influence had to be stopped before they could cause even more damage. Second, God decided that the Nephilim giants had to be destroyed. These creatures were so violent and evil that they could not be reformed or rehabilitated. They were a constant threat to every innocent person on earth, and they would never stop their violence and cannibalism as long as they lived. Third, God decided that human civilization itself needed a fresh start. The corruption had spread so far and so deep that it could not be simply reformed or gradually improved. The only solution was to wash the earth clean and begin again with people who still remembered how to love and serve God. But before any of this could happen, God wanted to make sure that future generations would understand what had occurred and why his judgment was necessary. He needed someone to witness these events and record them for posterity. He needed someone who could see both the earthly and the heavenly sides of what was happening. This is where Enoch came into the story in a very special way. God had been preparing Enoch for this role throughout his life. Enoch's faithfulness, his close relationship with God, and his pure heart made him the perfect person to serve as God's witness and recorder of these momentous events. Chapter 8: Enoch's Journey to Heaven. One day, as Enoch was walking with God as he did every day, something extraordinary happened. God told Enoch that he was going to show him things that no other human being had ever seen. Enoch was going about his normal daily activities when he felt God's presence with him in a way that was different from usual. The air around him seemed to shimmer and glow. A warm, peaceful feeling filled his heart, but at the same time, he sensed that something very important was about to happen. Then Enoch heard God's voice speaking to him more clearly than he had ever heard it before. God told him to prepare himself for a journey unlike any journey that any person had ever taken. God was going to bring Enoch up to heaven itself so that he could see the spiritual realm with his own eyes. At first, Enoch was frightened. He was just a human being, and heaven was the place where God lived. How could a mortal man survive in such a holy and powerful place? But God assured Enoch that he would protect him and give him the strength he needed for what he was about to experience. Suddenly, Enoch felt himself being lifted up from the earth. It was not like flying in an airplane, because airplanes had not been invented yet. It was more like being carried by invisible, gentle hands. Enoch rose higher and higher, past the clouds, past the sky, into regions that no human eye had ever seen. As he traveled upward, Enoch began to see things that amazed him. He saw layers of heaven that he had never imagined existed. He saw beautiful lights and colors that were more brilliant than anything on earth. He heard music that was more lovely than any earthly song. He felt peace and joy that were deeper than any happiness he had ever experienced. The first heaven that Enoch passed through was where the birds flew and the clouds formed. But as he continued upward, he entered the second heaven, where he began to see spiritual things more clearly. Here, he saw angels going about their duties, carrying messages from God and watching over the earth below. But Enoch also saw something troubling in this part of heaven. He saw the fallen watchers who had rebelled against God. They were being held in a place of punishment, but they were not yet in their final prison. They looked miserable and ashamed, very different from the glorious beings they had once been. Some of the fallen watchers saw Enoch passing by, and they called out to him. They begged him to intercede for them with God. They asked him to plead their case and ask God to forgive them and let them return to their former positions. They seemed genuinely sorry for what they had done, and they promised that they would never rebel again if God would give them another chance. Enoch felt sorry for these fallen angels. Even though they had done terrible things, they had once been glorious servants of God, and now they were suffering greatly for their rebellion. Their punishment was already severe, and Enoch could see that they were truly miserable. But God explained to Enoch that the fallen watchers' punishment was just and necessary. They had not simply made a mistake or a poor decision. They had deliberately chosen to rebel against God's clear commandments. They had corrupted God's creation and caused tremendous suffering to innocent people. Their actions had consequences that could not simply be erased by saying they were sorry. As Enoch continued his journey upward, he entered the third heaven, where he saw even more wonderful things. Here was the Garden of Eden, more beautiful than it had ever been on earth. Here were the tree of life and rivers of crystal clear water. Here Enoch saw the place that God had prepared for righteous people after they died. But Enoch also saw the place of punishment for wicked people. It was a place of darkness and fire, where people who had chosen evil over good would suffer for their choices. This was not a place where God sent people to be cruel to them, but rather the natural result of choosing to live apart from God's love and light. Finally, Enoch was brought into the highest heaven, where God's throne was located. This was the most amazing and overwhelming experience of his entire journey. The glory of God was so bright and powerful that Enoch could barely look at it. The holiness and purity of this place was beyond anything that words could describe. Around God's throne, Enoch saw countless angels worshipping and serving God with perfect joy and devotion. These were the angels who had remained faithful during all the rebellions and troubles. They sang praises to God with voices that sounded like thunder and like gentle music at the same time. Here in God's presence, Enoch began to understand the full scope of what was happening in the spiritual realm. He could see the ongoing battle between good and evil, not just as it appeared on earth, but as it really was in the spiritual dimension. He could see how every choice that people made on earth had spiritual consequences that reached far beyond what anyone could imagine. God began to show Enoch visions of the past, present, and future. Enoch saw the original rebellion of Satan and how it had led to all the subsequent problems on earth. He saw how the fallen watchers' rebellion was part of this larger cosmic conflict between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. Chapter 9: The War in Heaven, Michael versus the Watchers. As Enoch watched from his position near God's throne, he witnessed something that shook him to his very core. He saw the great war in heaven between the faithful angels led by Michael and the rebellious forces that supported the fallen watchers. This was not the first war that had been fought in heaven. Long before, when Satan first rebelled against God, there had been a great battle that resulted in Satan and his followers being cast out of heaven. But this new conflict was different in some ways, because it involved angels who had been faithful for a long time after Satan's rebellion, but who had now fallen into their own form of disobedience. The war began when God commanded the Archangel Michael to gather the faithful angels and remove the fallen watchers from their positions of authority over the earth. This was not going to be as simple as just telling them to leave. The fallen watchers had tasted earthly power and pleasure, and they did not want to give it up. They were prepared to fight to keep what they had taken. Michael was the greatest warrior in all of heaven. He was tall and strong and radiant with the glory of God. His armor shined like the sun, and his sword blazed with heavenly fire. When he spoke, his voice was like thunder that could be heard throughout all the heavenly realms. All the faithful angels looked to him as their leader and commander. But Michael was not cruel or violent by nature. He was a being of perfect love and justice. He did not want to fight against his former brothers, the fallen watchers. He would have much preferred to see them repent and return to faithful service to God. But he also understood that sometimes force is necessary to stop evil from spreading and to protect innocent people from harm. The fallen watchers were led by Semjaza, the angel who had first organized their rebellion. Even in his fallen state, Semjaza was still powerful and impressive. He had convinced many of his fellow watchers that they were in the right and that God was being unfair to them. He told them that they should not have to give up the earthly lives they had built for themselves. But Semjaza and the fallen watchers faced a serious problem. When they rebelled against God, they cut themselves off from the source of their power. Angels get their strength and abilities from their connection to God. The more they rebel against God, the weaker they become spiritually, even if they still seem strong compared to human beings. Michael, on the other hand, was drawing his power directly from God. His strength was not his own strength, but God's strength flowing through him. This made him far more powerful than any of the fallen watchers, even when they worked together against him. The battle itself was unlike any earthly war. These were spiritual beings fighting with spiritual weapons in spiritual dimensions. They did not use swords and spears like human soldiers. Instead, they fought with light and darkness, with truth and deception, with love and hatred. The weapons they used were their own spiritual natures and the power that came from their relationship or lack of relationship with God. Enoch watched in amazement as Michael confronted Semjaza and the other fallen watchers. The archangel's presence was so bright and holy that the fallen angels could barely stand to be near him. When Michael spoke, his words carried the authority of God himself, and the fallen watchers trembled at the sound. Michael commanded the fallen watchers to abandon their earthly activities and submit to God's judgment. He offered them one last chance to repent and ask for God's mercy, but most of them were too proud and too attached to their earthly pleasures to accept this offer. They chose to fight rather than to surrender. The battle raged across multiple dimensions of heaven and earth. As the spiritual conflict intensified, its effects could be felt in the physical world as well. Earthquakes shook the ground, lightning flashed across the sky, storms raged with supernatural fury. The very elements of creation responded to the spiritual war that was being fought over them. One by one, the fallen watchers were defeated by Michael and the faithful angels. No matter how hard they fought, they could not overcome the power of God that was working through their opponents. Their rebellion had made them weak, while the faithful angels' obedience had made them strong. As each fallen watcher was defeated, he was bound with chains of darkness and taken to a place of imprisonment. This was not a physical prison like the jails that humans build, but a spiritual prison where rebellious angels are held until the final judgment. It was a place of darkness and isolation, far from the light and joy of God's presence. Azazel, who had taught humans how to make weapons and jewelry, was bound and cast into a desert place where sharp rocks cut him constantly. This was a fitting punishment for one who had taught humans to cut and wound each other with metal weapons. Semjaza and the other leaders of the rebellion were chained in the deepest places of darkness, where they would remain until the end of the world. Their punishment was more severe because they had led others into sin and rebellion. Some of the fallen watchers tried to escape by hiding among humans on Earth, but Michael and his angels pursued them there as well. No place in all of creation was beyond the reach of God's justice. One by one, all of the fallen watchers were captured and imprisoned. Enoch watched this entire cosmic battle with wonder and fear. He could see that this was not just a conflict between individual angels, but a battle for the future of all creation. If the fallen watchers had been allowed to continue their rebellion, they would have eventually corrupted everything that God had made. But he also saw the tremendous cost of this rebellion. Angels who had once been brothers now fought against each other. Beings who had once served God together in harmony were now divided into enemies. The unity and peace of heaven had been shattered by pride and disobedience. Chapter 10: The Punishment and Imprisonment. After Michael and the faithful angels had defeated the fallen watchers in battle, it was time for God's judgment to be carried out. Enoch was chosen to witness this judgment so that he could record it for future generations. The punishment of the fallen watchers was both terrible and just. Each angel received consequences that matched the particular ways in which he had rebelled against God and harmed his creation. God's justice is always perfect, which means that every punishment fits exactly with the crime that was committed. Semjaza, who had been the leader of the rebellion, received the harshest punishment of all. He was bound with chains of iron and cast into the deepest pit of darkness. There he would remain in complete isolation until the final judgment at the end of the world. He would have thousands of years to think about his choices and to regret the pride that had led him to rebel against God. But Semjaza's punishment was not just solitary confinement. He was also forced to watch the consequences of his rebellion playing out on Earth. He could see the violence and suffering that his actions had caused. He could see how his decision to rebel had led to the corruption of human civilization and the deaths of countless innocent people. This knowledge tormented him even more than his physical imprisonment. Azazel, who had taught humans to make weapons and to focus on their physical appearance rather than their character, was taken to a desert place filled with sharp stones and burning sand. He was bound there with his face covered, so that he could not see the light of the sun or stars. The rocks constantly cut and scraped him, and the burning heat tormented him day and night. This punishment was particularly appropriate because Azazel had taught humans to cut and wound each other with metal weapons. Now he himself experienced constant cutting and wounding. He had also taught people to cover their faces with cosmetics to make themselves appear more beautiful than they really were. Now his own face was permanently covered, and his true ugly nature was hidden from view. The other fallen watchers were each imprisoned in places that reflected their particular sins. Those who had taught humans about poisonous plants were placed in areas filled with deadly vapors and toxic substances. Those who had taught sorcery and magic were bound in places where dark spiritual forces constantly tormented them. Those who had encouraged violence and warfare were imprisoned in places of constant conflict and pain. But the punishment of the fallen watchers was not the end of God's judgment. Something also had to be done about their children, the Nephilim giants who were terrorizing the earth. These creatures were too dangerous to be allowed to continue living, but they also presented a unique problem because they were part human. God decided that the Nephilim themselves would be destroyed, but their spirits would not be allowed to rest in peace like the spirits of normal humans who died. Instead, the spirits of the dead Nephilim would become demons that would wander the earth, seeking to possess and corrupt living people. This was a terrible fate, but it was the natural result of their unnatural origin and their evil lives. Enoch watched as God's judgment was pronounced on the Nephilim. He saw that these giant creatures would be killed by various disasters, floods, earthquakes, wars among themselves, and diseases that would waste their enormous bodies. None of them would be allowed to survive to continue their violence and cannibalism. The destruction of the Nephilim would not happen all at once, but it would be thorough and complete. Some would die in the great flood that God was planning to send upon the earth. Others would be killed by natural disasters or by fighting among themselves. But within a few generations, all of the Nephilim would be gone from the earth. Enoch also learned about the punishment that would come upon the human beings who had willingly participated in the rebellion of the fallen watchers. Not all humans were equally guilty. Some had been forced to serve the Nephilim and had had no choice in the matter. Others had been deceived by the false teachings of the fallen watchers and did not understand what they were really doing. But some humans had eagerly embraced the rebellion and had willingly chosen to serve evil rather than good. These people had used the forbidden knowledge they learned from the fallen watchers to hurt and exploit other people. They had practiced sorcery and demon worship. They had become almost as evil as the fallen angels themselves. God's judgment on these wicked humans would come in the form of the great flood that he was planning. The flood would wash away the corrupt civilization that had been built under the influence of the fallen watchers. Only a few righteous people would be saved to start human civilization over again on a clean foundation. As Enoch witnessed all of these judgments being pronounced and carried out, he was struck by both the severity and the fairness of God's justice. The punishments were terrible, but they were exactly what was needed to deal with the terrible evil that had been unleashed by the rebellion of the Watchers. He also saw that God's judgment was not driven by anger or cruelty, but by love. God loved his creation too much to allow it to be completely destroyed by evil. Sometimes love requires tough action to protect the innocent and to stop the spread of corruption. The imprisonment of the fallen Watchers served several important purposes. It stopped them from continuing to corrupt human civilization with their forbidden teachings. It prevented them from producing more Nephilim children who would terrorize the earth. It demonstrated to all of creation that rebellion against God has serious consequences, and it gave hope to faithful people that evil would not be allowed to triumph in the end. Enoch understood that this judgment was not the final end of the story. The fallen Watchers would remain in their prisons until the end of the world, when there would be a final judgment of all created beings. At that time, their fate would be sealed forever, and God's justice would be complete. Chapter 11. Enoch's Visions of the Future. After showing Enoch the judgment of the fallen Watchers, God began to reveal to him visions of what would happen in the future. These visions helped Enoch understand that the conflict he had witnessed was part of a much larger story that would continue until the end of time. The first vision God showed to Enoch was of the great flood that would soon come upon the earth. Enoch saw dark clouds gathering in the sky, not just in one place, but all over the world. He saw rain beginning to fall, gently at first, but then harder and harder until it became a tremendous downpour that did not stop. But the water did not come only from the rain. Enoch saw great fountains of water bursting up from deep within the earth. It was as if God had opened up all the hidden reservoirs of water that he had stored beneath the ground when he first created the world. Water came from above and from below at the same time, covering everything. Enoch watched sadly as the flood waters rose higher and higher. He saw the great cities that the Nephilim had built being covered by the water. He saw the monuments to human pride disappearing beneath the waves. All the corrupted civilization that had been built under the influence of the fallen Watchers was being washed away. But Enoch also saw something hopeful in this vision. He saw a large boat floating safely on top of the flood waters. In this boat was a man named Noah and his family. God had warned Noah about the coming flood and had told him to build the boat to save himself and his loved ones. Noah had believed God and had spent many years building the boat, even though other people laughed at him. The boat also contained many different kinds of animals, 2 of every kind and 7 of some kinds. God was making sure that after the flood was over, the earth could be filled with life again. The flood would destroy the corrupted civilization, but it would not destroy all of God's creation. Enoch saw that after the flood waters went down, Noah and his family would leave the boat and start human civilization over again. This new beginning would be much smaller and simpler than what had existed before, but it would be clean and free from the influence of the fallen watchers. Then God showed Enoch visions of what would happen in the much more distant future. He saw that even after the flood, human beings would still struggle with sin and rebellion. The fallen angels were imprisoned, but the human tendency toward evil was still present in people's hearts. Enoch saw great nations rising and falling throughout history. He saw wars and conquests, times of peace and times of trouble. He saw how some people in every generation would choose to serve God faithfully, while others would choose to rebel against him in various ways. But the most amazing vision that God showed to Enoch was of someone special who would come to earth in the future. This person would be both human and divine at the same time. He would be born as a baby, but he would also be the Son of God himself. Enoch saw that this special person would live a perfect life, never sinning or rebelling against God in any way. He would teach people about God's love and forgiveness. He would heal sick people and help those who were in trouble. He would show people what God is really like by the way he lived and treated others. But Enoch also saw something very sad in this vision. He saw that many people would reject this perfect person. They would hate him because his goodness made their own evil look worse by comparison. They would eventually kill him, even though he had never done anything wrong to anyone. However, Enoch saw that this death would not be the end of the story. 3 days after this person died, he would come back to life again. His resurrection would prove that he really was who he claimed to be, the Son of God. It would also prove that God's power is stronger than death itself. Enoch understood that this person's death and resurrection would provide a way for all the sin and rebellion in the world to be forgiven. People who believed in him and asked for his forgiveness would be able to have their relationship with God restored. They would be able to escape the punishment that their sins deserved. This was incredibly good news because it meant that the damage done by the fallen Watcher's rebellion could be completely repaired. People who had been corrupted by sin could be made clean and pure again. The broken relationship between God and humanity could be healed. God also showed Enoch visions of the very end of time. He saw that someday God would create a new heaven and a new earth where there would be no more sin, no more rebellion, and no more suffering. All the faithful people from throughout history would live there together with God forever. In this new creation, there would be no more war between good and evil, because evil would be completely defeated and removed. There would be no more death or pain or sadness. Everyone would live in perfect peace and happiness with God and with each other. Enoch saw that the fallen Watchers and all other rebellious beings would face their final judgment at this time. They would be cast into a lake of fire where they would be punished forever for their rebellion. This was not because God enjoyed punishing them, but because justice required that evil receive its proper consequences. But for those who had remained faithful to God, or who had repented of their sins and received forgiveness through the special person who would come, the future was incredibly bright. They would receive new bodies that would never get sick or grow old. They would live in a perfect world where everything was exactly as God intended it to be. These visions helped Enoch understand that the conflict he had witnessed between Michael and the fallen watchers was not just an isolated event. It was part of the ongoing battle between good and evil that would continue throughout all of history until God finally brought it to an end. Chapter 12, The Final Judgment. The last and most awesome vision that God showed to Enoch was of the final judgment, when all created beings would stand before God to receive their eternal destiny based on the choices they had made. Enoch saw a great white throne that was brighter than the sun and more magnificent than anything that existed on earth or in heaven. On this throne sat God himself in all his glory and majesty. The light that came from him was so brilliant that it illuminated every corner of the universe. There was nowhere to hide from his presence. Around the throne stood countless millions of angels, all of them faithful servants who had never rebelled against God. They were there as witnesses to God's perfect justice. Their faces shined with joy because they knew that finally, after all the ages of conflict between good and evil, God's righteousness would be completely vindicated. Before the throne, Enoch saw all the people who had ever lived on earth. Everyone who had ever been born was there, from Adam and Eve to the last person who would ever live. Rich and poor, kings and servants, young and old, all of them stood together before God's throne, waiting for their final judgment. Enoch also saw all the angels who had ever been created, including both the faithful ones and the fallen ones. The fallen watchers were there, brought up from their prisons to face their final sentencing. Satan and all his demons were there too. Every created being in the universe was present for this ultimate accounting. God opened great books that contained the record of every action, every word, and every thought of every created being throughout all of history. Nothing had been forgotten or overlooked. Every deed done in secret was written down. Every motive of the heart was recorded. God's knowledge of all things was perfect and complete. The judgment began with the fallen angels, since they had been the first to rebel and had led others into sin. Semjaza and the other fallen watchers were brought before the throne first. The charges against them were read from the books: how they had abandoned their assigned duties, how they had corrupted human civilization, how they had taught forbidden knowledge, how their actions had led to violence and death for countless innocent people. The fallen watchers had no defense to offer. They could not deny what they had done, because the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. They could not claim that they did not know their actions were wrong, because God had made His will clear to them. They could not blame others for their choices, because each of them had decided freely to rebel. The sentence was pronounced: eternal punishment in the lake of fire. This was not a place that God had created for them originally. but it was the only appropriate destination for beings who had permanently chosen to oppose God and His righteousness. They had rejected God's love and grace, so they would spend eternity separated from Him. Satan and his demons received the same sentence. They too had chosen rebellion over obedience, hatred over love, destruction over creation. They had spent all their time trying to corrupt and destroy what God had made. Now they would face the consequences of their choices. Then came the judgment of human beings. This was more complex than the judgment of the angels, because humans had been influenced by the fallen angels and had not always understood what they were choosing between. God's perfect wisdom took all of this into account. Some people had lived before the special person that Enoch had seen in his earlier vision had come to earth. These people were judged based on how they had responded to the knowledge of God that they had. Those who had tried to live righteously and who had sought to know and serve God were welcomed into eternal life. Other people had lived after the special person came to earth and died and rose again. These people were judged based on whether they had accepted or rejected the salvation that He offered. Those who had believed in Him and received His forgiveness were clothed in His righteousness and welcomed into God's presence. But sadly, Enoch saw that many people throughout history had chosen to reject God's love and to live for themselves instead. Some had been influenced by the fallen watchers or their demonic spirits. Others had simply chosen selfishness over love, pride over humility, hatred over kindness. These people faced the same fate as the fallen angels. They had chosen to align themselves with rebellion against God, so they would share in the punishment that rebellion brought. This was not what God wanted for any of them, but it was the natural result of the choices they had made. Enoch wept as he watched this part of the judgment, because he could see how many people were lost. But he also understood that God's justice was perfect and fair. Everyone received exactly what their choices had earned them. No one was punished unfairly, and no one's good deeds were overlooked or forgotten. After the judgment was complete, Enoch saw the old heaven and earth pass away. Everything that had been corrupted by sin was destroyed completely. The physical universe as it had existed was gone forever, along with all the pain and suffering and death that sin had brought into it. But then Enoch saw something wonderful beyond all imagination. God created a new heaven and a new earth that were more beautiful and perfect than the original creation had ever been. This new creation was designed to be the eternal home for all those who had been saved from judgment. In this new heaven and new earth, there was no more death or crying or pain. All the old troubles were gone forever. The people who lived there were perfectly happy and perfectly good. They spent their time worshiping God, loving each other, and enjoying all the wonderful things God had made for them. God Himself came to live with His people in this new creation. There was no need for a temple or a special holy place, because God was everywhere present with them. They could see His face and talk with Him directly, just as Adam and Eve had done in the Garden of Eden long ago. The righteous angels rejoiced and celebrated with the saved humans. Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Uriel were there, along with all the other angels who had remained faithful to God. They sang songs of victory and praised God for his wisdom and his justice and his mercy. The war that had begun so long ago in heaven was finally over completely. Good had triumphed over evil. Light had defeated darkness. Love had conquered hatred. And it would never be threatened again, because God had removed all possibility of rebellion from his new creation. Enoch saw all of this and marveled at the greatness of God's plan. Everything that had happened, even the terrible rebellion of the Watchers, had been used by God to accomplish his ultimate purposes. Out of the tragedy and suffering had come an even greater glory and joy than would have otherwise been possible. Closing reflections. The message for us today. The story of the Watchers and the war in heaven is not just an ancient tale. It has important lessons for us who live thousands of years later. First, this story teaches us that spiritual things are real. There really are angels and demons, heaven and hell, God and Satan. The spiritual world is not just make-believe or imagination. It is as real as the physical world we can see and touch. And what happens there affects everything that happens here on earth. Second, this story teaches us that choices have consequences. The Watchers made a choice to disobey God, and that choice led to terrible suffering for themselves and for many others. Every choice we make matters. When we choose to follow God, we are joining the side of light and life. When we choose to reject God, we are joining the side of darkness and death. Third, this story teaches us about the danger of pride and selfish desire. The Watchers fell because they wanted to be more than God had made them to be. They wanted to have things that God had not given them. They thought they knew better than God what would make them happy. This same pride and selfish desire is still the root of most sin in our world today. Fourth, this story teaches us that God is both just and merciful. He did not ignore the rebellion of the Watchers or pretend that their sins did not matter. He punished evil and protected the innocent, but he also showed mercy by saving Noah and his family, and ultimately by sending his Son to save all who would believe in him. Fifth, this story teaches us that God's plans cannot be stopped. Even though the Watchers tried to corrupt and destroy God's creation, they could not ultimately succeed. God was able to overcome their rebellion and accomplish his purposes anyway. No matter how dark things might seem, God is still in control, and his good plans will prevail in the end. Sixth, this story teaches us to be careful about what knowledge we seek and what we allow into our minds and hearts. The fallen Watchers taught people things that seemed interesting and useful, but that actually led them away from God. Today, we also face temptations to pursue knowledge or experiences that might harm us spiritually, even if they seem attractive. Seventh, this story teaches us about the reality of spiritual warfare. There really is a battle between good and evil that is being fought all around us, even though we cannot always see it with our physical eyes. We need to be aware of this battle and make sure we are on God's side in it. Eighth, this story teaches us about God's patience. He did not judge the fallen watchers immediately when they first sinned. He gave them time, and he gave humanity time too. Even when things were at their worst, God was working out a plan to bring salvation and redemption. This same patience is still at work today as God gives people chances to turn to Him. Ninth, this story teaches us about the importance of faithfulness in difficult times. Enoch lived in a world that was becoming more and more evil, but he chose to keep walking with God anyway. Noah lived in the same evil world, and he chose to obey God even when everyone else thought he was foolish. We too may live in times when it is not easy or popular to follow God, but we must remain faithful like Enoch and Noah did. Finally, this story teaches us about hope. No matter how bad things become, God has a plan to make everything right in the end. He will judge evil, reward faithfulness, and create a new world where righteousness dwells forever. This gives us hope to keep going even when times are hard, because we know that God's story has a happy ending for those who love Him. Enoch walked with God for 365 years, and then God took him to heaven without dying. He spent the rest of eternity in God's presence, having seen things that few other humans would ever see. His story was preserved in the writings that bear his name, and these writings have fascinated and inspired people for thousands of years. The Book of Enoch was treasured by many early believers in Jesus. They read it to understand more about angels and demons, about the spiritual world, and about God's plans for the end of the age. Some of the New Testament writers, including Jude and Peter, seem to have been familiar with Enoch's writings and referred to the events they described. Today, we can read both the Bible and the Book of Enoch to learn about these amazing events. We can see how the rebellion of the Watchers helps explain why there is so much evil in our world. We can understand better how spiritual forces are at work behind many of the troubles we face. And we can be encouraged to remain faithful to God no matter what challenges we encounter. The war that Enoch witnessed in heaven was not the end of the story. It was really just one chapter in the much larger story of God's dealing with rebellion and His work to restore His creation to righteousness. That larger story continues today and will continue until God's final judgment and the creation of the new heaven and new earth. We are all part of this continuing story. Each of us must choose which side we will be on in the spiritual battle between good and evil. Will we follow the example of the fallen Watchers who chose pride and rebellion? Or will we follow the example of Enoch who chose faithfulness and obedience? Will we align ourselves with the angels of light or the angels of darkness? The good news is that no matter what we may have done in the past, God offers us forgiveness and a fresh start through faith in Jesus Christ. Just as God saved Noah and his family from the judgment of the flood, He offers to save us from the judgment that is coming. Just as God had a plan to deal with the corruption caused by the Watchers, He has a plan to deal with the corruption that sin has caused in our own lives. The story of the Watchers reminds us that the battle between good and evil is real and that the stakes are incredibly high. But it also reminds us that God has already won the ultimate victory. The outcome is not in doubt. Evil will be defeated, righteousness will triumph, and God's people will live with Him forever in perfect joy and peace. So let us learn from Enoch's example. Let us walk with God every day. Let us remain faithful even when the world around us is unfaithful. Let us resist the temptations that the spiritual forces of darkness put in our path. Let us trust in God's goodness and His plan even when we do not fully understand what He is doing. And let us look forward to that coming day when God will make all things new. A day when the war between good and evil will be over forever. A day when we will see God face to face and live in His presence for all eternity. A day when the promises that Enoch saw in his visions will be completely fulfilled. This is the message that Enoch brought back from his journey to heaven. This is the warning and the hope that he shared with his generation and with all the generations that would come after. The watchers fell, but God's plan stood firm. Evil arose, but good will ultimately triumph. Darkness came, but light will shine forever. May we have eyes to see the spiritual realities that Enoch saw. May we have hearts to choose faithfulness like he chose. May we have courage to stand for righteousness in an unrighteous world. And may we have hope in the final victory that God has promised to those who love Him. The war in heaven that Enoch witnessed was terrible and wonderful all at once. Terrible because it showed how far spiritual beings could fall when they chose to rebel against God. Wonderful because it showed God's power to overcome that rebellion and His determination to protect and save those who trust in Him. As we look back on this ancient story, we see ourselves in it. We see the choices we face every day. We see the temptations that pull us away from God. We see the spiritual battles that rage around us. We see the consequences of both obedience and rebellion. And we see the amazing grace of a God who offers salvation to all who will receive it. The story of Enoch and the Watchers is ultimately the story of all humanity. It is the story of rebellion and redemption, of judgment and mercy, of darkness and light, of death and life. It is a story that continues to unfold in our own time, and each of us plays a part in it. May we choose wisely. May we walk faithfully. May we trust completely. And may we, like Enoch, walk with God all the days of our lives until He calls us home to be with Him forever. This is the story that Enoch saw and recorded. This is the war that shook heaven and earth. This is the judgment that fell on the Watchers and their followers. This is the salvation that God provided for those who remained faithful to Him. This is the hope that sustains us as we await the final victory of good over evil. Let all who read this account take it to heart and let it change how they live. For the spiritual world is real, the battle is ongoing, and the day of final judgment is coming. But for those who walk with God as Enoch did, that day will be a day of joy and celebration, not of fear and sorrow. The war in heaven has been fought. The victory has been won. Now it is our turn to choose which side we will stand on when the final chapter of this great story is written. May we all choose wisely and well.